Good morning, everyone. We're delighted we have so many of you again joining us this morning for Fáilte Ireland's continuing series of expert webinars. This morning's session is a two-part session focused on HR, impending HR challenges, policy plans and payroll, particularly focused today on the EWSS scheme. As an industry, we have never been in such a challenging position and trying to navigate so many hurdles. We in Fáilte Ireland are supporting industry today to ensure you have the latest information and guidance in light of the impending deadlines regarding transitioning your staff to the new employment support schemes. We are delighted to be joined by our HR expert Caroline McEnery, and Caroline will be guiding us through the relevant detail and changes and responding to your questions from industry owners and HR managers who are seeking that clarity on those impending HR changes. So before we invite Caroline to start the session, I'm going to hand you over to Amanda Horan, Manager Enterprise Development, to go through this morning's housekeeping, the Q&A, and Amanda will be moderating the session for us this morning. So we hope you find this session really helpful. And now over to you, Amanda.
Thanks, Martina, and good morning, everybody. Thank you for taking the time today to be here. It's great to see so many of you tuned in, which I think is a testament really to the importance of this topic and the timeliness of the webinar today, given some impending deadlines we're going to be talking about. As Martina noted, the objective today is to support you with this webinar and the second webinar, which we'll run on the 8th of September, to guide you through what will be such a big part of the management of your business in the coming months, and to ensure that you work to realign your HR policies, plans and organisational staffing structures in accordance to the emerging business demand of the shoulder and off season. Which undoubtedly will be very different to the previous year's business trajectories that you would have seen. So we've set aside about an hour this morning for the session, and that'll include some time to address many questions that you may have, as many as we can cover in the time allowed. You're probably aware that this is the first of a two-part webinar, the second on the 8th of September, and on that one we'll be running through some more detail around the HR restructuring and implications around layoff, short-time working, and also some scenario planning around that, and if the issue of redundancy has to be addressed by you in the organisation at an individual employee level or at a collective redundancy level. So that's coming in the second webinar. So if you haven't registered for that today, go back to the invitation to this event that you got and make sure you've registered for that for the 8th of September. So to ensure that you also feel very engaged with this, we're adding in some question polls to this morning's session. So you get the opportunity to sense check where you're at in terms of your HR planning against those of your industry colleagues who are participating on the webinar. So I think that'll be quite interesting and engaging to see, you know, where you're at in your planning process against the other colleagues in the industry. And as you know, so we will probably, before I hand over to Caroline, I think we'll take that first poll question. So we invite you now to respond to that poll. Has your business commenced reviewing business demand for the next 3 to 6 months to determine employee resourcing levels required? So really just sense checking with you where you're at in that planning process right now. So we'll take the results of that. While we're waiting for those results, I just remind you again, we're joined by Caroline McEnery, HR and employment law expert and former member of the Low Pay Commission, as well as being an active adjudicator in the Workplace Relations Commission. Caroline, as you know, comes to us with over 20 years industry experience from retail, food production and hospitality sectors. So she really very much understands the challenges you're now all grappling with. So before I pass over to Caroline, Colette, maybe you'd be able to share with us that review of the first poll if we have. Oh, well, that's great to see that we have so many strong responses of participants who have actually started that process of assessing employee resource levels in light of business demand. So that's great to see. And for those of you who haven't, we hope that today's webinar will give you the confidence to actually start that process. So just to give you an idea then, today's webinar, we're going to cover the implications of government guidelines, updates from the 18th of August.
This webinar has been updated to incorporate some of the changes that have been announced in the government guidelines since this webinar was recorded.
Looking at the eligibility and detail of the application and administration of the EWSS, a look at layoff, how to handle that, and access to PUP and some impending changes around that scheme, as well as how to revisit your policy and approach to handling absence management, something that many of you did raise with us in the questions submitted in advance of today. We'll also take a look at travel guidelines and the implications of that on your staff. And a reminder then of the importance of wellbeing supports as you move to consider some fundamental and difficult decisions on HR restructuring for the business. So with that in mind, I'm going to hand over to you, Caroline.
This webinar has been updated to incorporate some of the changes that have been announced in the government guidelines since this webinar was recorded. Thanks so much, Amanda. Delighted to be back with Fáilte Ireland and assisting with these HR updates. And we have a very timely and comprehensive session for you this morning. As Amanda said, it's been very much tailored to suit the questions that have come in, and hopefully it'll give you lots of practical, up-to-date advice. So to start with, we've had updates, the most recent update from the government on the 18th of August, and ultimately, I suppose that update reiterated the importance of allowing remote working where it is practicable. For many of you, that may not be practicable, but for behind the scenes type of jobs, it may. So where it's possible, it's being encouraged that you do that. There's an increase in terms of the amount of testing that's happening with COVID. We're finding that a number of clients have started initiating COVID testing themselves, where they're finding it challenging to ensure the distancing or the face masks, etc., in specific industries. And also the HSE have started testing in the counties that were locked down, and also now around the country in relation to meat and food processing. So I think you'll see more of that. People are being encouraged to avoid public transport. Obviously, for your industry particularly, the visits to home for 6 people from 3 households and how that's being manifested is definitely presenting huge challenges. Over 70s are being encouraged to have designated shopping hours and also to limit their contact, outdoor activities and matches, etc., wedding receptions, other internal groups and outdoor activities have all been restricted as well. So there's some of the guidelines just to make you familiar with. But today's main focus for us is going to be very much around transitioning from the different schemes. So in that backdrop, the TWSS scheme, or the temporary wage subsidy scheme, which was in place, is going to be replaced from the 1st of September and is going to be in place until the 31st of March 21. It's great for us to have certainty that it's in place until March, so businesses can now make strategic decisions around their workforce in light of that, and many already are deciding what is most appropriate in terms of maximising the scheme and also retaining talent within their business as a result of the scheme. There's also additional categories of workers that are going to be allowed to enter the EWSS, namely seasonal workers and new hires who have been taken on since July, and the July and August employees can be claimed for prior to the 5th of September. Any employer who's eligible for the scheme needs to show that they're operating on no more than 70% of their turnover this year in comparison to last year. And that can be done on a monthly basis, but also on a cumulative basis over the 6-month period. So the levels of the subsidy are also different, and the level of subsidy the employer will receive is per employee who has been paid a gross weekly wage rather than a net wage, and the gross weekly wage depends on what they actually get in terms of that subsidy. The payments are fully taxable, but the employer's PRSI rate for those on the scheme will remain at the reduced rate of 0.5%, which is welcome news. So the criteria then for the EWSS has increased in terms of now there's a requirement that as you register, which is the first step in the process, which wasn't required before, there isn't an automatic transition from the TWSS over to the EWSS. So you need to register, and as you register, you need to be able to have and show that you have a valid tax clearance cert. If you don't, you need to apply for one to be eligible for this scheme. The business, as we mentioned, has to show that there's a 30% reduction in turnover or in customer orders between July and December 2020. And you need to look at it on a monthly basis to decide if you apply each month, but also you need to look at it over the period also, which is the way revenue will look at it. So that's important to take into account. The disruption also needs to be caused via COVID, which again won't be an issue, and you need to be registered for PAYE and PRSI. So the next consideration is there's really good revenue guidelines that were published and dated the 14th of August, and we're expecting that they will be updated on a regular basis. We're expecting further clarification in relation to these 3 points, but we just wanted to highlight to you today that there's certain eligibility criteria, and they've mentioned some exceptions and some inclusions. So certain proprietary directors will be able to claim eligibility for this scheme, and we await further details from revenue in relation to this specific. Newly hired connected parties who are not on the payroll and paid between that period of time, and they include brothers, sisters, immediate relations like aunts, uncles, nieces, nephews of an individual and their spouse, and employees employed other than as part of the business, so people who might be employed as childminder in a person's home, etc. So we await further details from revenue in relation to those. They've said that they will follow, so we hopefully will get those quite soon. So from the 18th of August, registration process has been opened for the EWSS, and it's open via Revenue's online service. Applications will only be processed if you are registered for PAYE and PRSI, have a bank account linked to that, have your tax clearance cert, and the process is a registration system that's self-declaration. So it's important that you register as soon as possible, and because registration is separate from submitting a claim. And for some employers, they may make a claim, for example, for the month of September, they may not make a claim for the month of October, November. So you need to register. Once you are registered, then you make your submission once that's been approved. So how it operates, I suppose the levels, you can't claim for staff on lower hours. The company is unable to claim for staff who are on less than 150, 150. And that was a question that came in from a lot of the questions in advance of today's webinar. So it doesn't matter how many hours the employee is on. What is of relevance is what is their gross wage. So if they total less than 150, 150, they're not eligible. And the scheme is registered on a self-assessment basis, and it's important that you meet the criteria in relation to that. The subsidy will be paid into the employer's bank account, and it's paid once a month in arrears as soon as practicable after the return date, which is the 14th of the month. And that's a really important point to note, because there could be up to 6 weeks of a delay in you getting the payment into your bank account, which you need to consider from a cash flow perspective. And it's really important that you, as always, retain any relevant records. Another important point to note is if you have an employee who has multiple employments, you only deal with your employment, so you don't need to check are they working hours elsewhere, etc. That doesn't affect the subsidy for your employment with that employee. So really important to ensure you register first with Revenue before you submit your payroll for the EWSS support. So apply now, make sure that you avoid any delays and have all your relevant paperwork in line. As we mentioned, the arrears are something you need to take into account when you're doing your cash flow and your budgeting plan, and it's something that a lot of you have flagged as a concern, which again needs to be something that we take into account. So I'm going to pass you back to Amanda, and we do our next poll.
Great, thanks, Caroline. So I suppose in light of what Caroline has just covered with us, we might take a snapshot now, Paul, as to how many of you have actually done the exercise of assessing your eligibility for EWSS. And if you've considered yourself as eligible on that basis of the exercise, how many of you have progressed your application to register for EWSS at this point? And while we're waiting for your views on that or your position on that, Caroline, another question here that has come in. Can an employee claim employee welfare support while the employer is claiming EWSS at the same time? This probably is relevant in the case of you've been moved to short-time working and you want to claim welfare support for the days you're not working. Can you clarify on that?
No problem, Amanda. So this, I think, is something that's going to come up for a lot of employees and employers due to the season we're coming into. So the subsidy is a benefit for the employer, social welfare is a benefit for the employee. So they will both be managed separately. So the employee can claim for whatever relevant payment they're entitled to, and the employer can claim for the subsidy. Again, that's a question that Revenue haven't clarified any further than that, but that's what we expect at the moment, Amanda.
Great, thanks, Caroline. And is there any guidance as to whether or not payment for annual leave will be supported under the EWSS scheme? As I'm sure many of you now will have staff entitled to take leave, given that they'll have been working over the last number of months. Caroline, any clarity on that?
So in the revenue guidelines, Amanda, it states that eligible employees have been defined, and it says further guidance will follow. I would say, though, in advance of that guidance, once the employee goes through for payroll that week of more than 150, I would expect that the subsidy would be applicable. If the employee doesn't go through for wages that week, I would say it won't be applicable. And I think that's probably how they're going to make that differentiation. So I expect it will, but again, we wait clarity from Revenue.
Okay, excellent. Thanks for that, Caroline. So Colette, if we have the results of that poll, it would be great to see it. Okay, that's really good news to know that people, the majority of you have actually looked at your eligibility at this stage and are progressing through the application process. And I think that is an important point, as Caroline has said, the need to apply separately for EWSS. You know, so it's not just a matter of putting in your employee claims, but there's an application process with those criteria that Caroline outlined. So Caroline, back over to you now.
Thank you, Amanda. So we've referenced those revenue guidelines in the presentation so far this morning and in Amanda's questions. And we know from the TWSS scheme that Revenue updated the guidelines for us on a very regular basis, and there was multiple drafts of those. So it's really important that whoever is responsible for payroll in your organisation, and indeed HR, makes themselves familiar with the Revenue guidelines. As I mentioned, we have only draft one at this stage, which is dated the 14th of August, but we expect that there'll be multiple drafts of those. And as questions come in, they generally update those questions, and we will get a lot more clarity as time goes on. So I think it will be very useful to have a look at those. So the next area we're going to move on to is the area of layoff.
In relation to the PUP payment, this is now being extended until the 1st of April 2021, and applications will be accepted up till the end of 2020. This is the most recent information we have in relation to this scheme, which has been updated since we recorded this webinar.
And this is an area that many of you will be familiar on the basis of having to lay people off already when the business was closed. A lot has changed since then, particularly in relation to the PUP scheme itself, and it's important that you're just aware in relation to that. So if you lay an employee off prior to the 17th of September, they will still be eligible for the PUP payment that will remain in place. However, if you lay an employee off after the 17th of September, they will not be eligible for the PUP payment and they will go on job seekers. And this is a crucial date. So again, you need to keep that in mind, because it could be, depending on what the employee is earning, the difference between job seekers, which is 203, and the current PUP maximum is €300. So it could be quite a significant amount in relation to that employee. It's also important to note that on the 17th of September, the employee's option to invoke redundancy, which has been currently paused, will also cease unless that has been extended further. In relation to the redundancy option for employees to request redundancy, since we recorded this webinar, this scheme is now paused until the 30th of November 2020. So if that occurs, you could see employees, if they don't go on the PUP payment, you could see the amount of employees who invoke redundancy increase. So again, just to be very aware of that important date during this presentation. So anybody who is laid off is entitled to the PUP payment, and those that are not in a position to come to work because of voluntarily leaving or any other reason are not eligible for the payment. So the payment rates are due to change in relation to the pandemic unemployment payment, which will be in place until April 2021 for those that are registered on the scheme prior to that key date of the 17th of September. So the rates are going to change on 3 occasions during that time, on the 17th of September, on the 1st of February, and also on the 1st of April 2021. But for now, the most relevant payment rates for this period of the 17th of September up to the 31st of January are for those earning less than the €200 per week, they get the 203. For those earning between 200 and 300, they get the 250. And for anyone earning over 300, they get a maximum of €300. So that's quite a difference in relation to the PUP payment and the social welfare payment. Layoff and the uncertainty that brings and the emotions that brings is obviously key in terms of how we manage that, and the proactiveness of communication that you all have been managing with your teams right throughout this crisis has definitely helped bring your teams with you, and that now has never been more important as we get into this next phase. So it's really important that even if you have no significant update, that you're continuing to update your staff. Most of you will have a mechanism of how to do that now, whether that's by e-sign, whether that's by a email update, or that's by a WhatsApp message or any other form. It's really important that you are doing that. Uncertainty, as we know, fuels anxiety. And even if you've no news, it's important that you're updating people in relation to your plans for the coming weeks and indeed months. The more you communicate, I suppose, the better it is, because people know that they've got a clear, honest, true and up-to-date message. So it's important that you look at your communication plan at the moment. So next, absence has, as Amanda highlighted, been one of the key questions that you presented to us in advance of today's webinar. So we've tried to cover as many of the key points associated with absence as we could. So the first key element of absence management at the moment is the COVID-19 enhanced illness benefit. So when a worker is told to self-isolate by a doctor or the HSC, either because they are a probable close contact or they have been diagnosed with the coronavirus, they can apply for the enhanced illness benefit payment of €350 a week. And to be eligible, the person must be confined to their home or a medical facility. And the idea is that they're a close contact and they're restricting their movement, or indeed they are confirmed with the coronavirus, and obviously they're confirmed by a medical doctor in that regard. So really important that first of all you make people aware of the process they should follow in relation to that. You should update your communication to staff in relation to the benefit to let them know that the benefit still continues of a flat rate of $350. So I suppose the idea of the payment was to ensure that people who have symptoms don't feel under financial pressure to attend work and they don't take any chances in that regard. The scheme was due to finish in August, but it has been extended until the 31st of March 2021, which is very welcome news indeed. So the next element in relation to managing absence is to review your current company policy in relation to absence, and particularly, is it fit for purpose in light of COVID-19? So again, have you stressed and highlighted if anybody has symptoms that they stay at home, give them the options in terms of communication, who they communicate with, what certificates are required. How do we deal with long-term absence? So for example, if you have somebody who has been out right throughout the pandemic because they may either have an underlying health condition, because they may just be afraid to come to work, etc., how are you going to start engaging with them if you haven't? And it's important that we do. And also, have you assessed vulnerable workers by doing a risk assessment, by involving your occupational health doctor and your company doctor, if that applies, to ensure that you've done a comprehensive assessment and have a more longer term plan with employees who have longer term absences. It's crucially important that you have a plan in place in relation to suspected cases of COVID-19. All of you will have done the return to work training with your staff in line with the government protocols when they returned. But it's important now that you're reminding staff in relation to what that protocol involves, what your internal policies require, etc., in relation to this, by doing lots of reinforcement and further training in that regard. It's also important to remember GDPR in light of COVID-19. It's important to remember that any medical data, or indeed any data you have in relation to employees, requires us to ensure we keep it safe and secure, and we respect the employee's privacy. You're holding sensitive personal data if it is medical data, or indeed any of the key HR data in relation to this area. So it's really important that you train your managers in relation to how to handle that data and how it's handled in a very controlled measure. We've had lots of incidents of people spreading news in relation to somebody either restricted movement, has a close contact, or indeed has coronavirus, where there's been lots of breaches of GDPR by quite senior managers in organisations. So it's important that you train people and restrict the amount of people employees should be telling in relation to their medical details. So the next very topical area is in relation to travel. I would make sure that you're following that guidelines, which is available from gov.ie, and using that as your requirement to update your policy, so employees need to follow it. So when you're looking at managing travel abroad, look at what does your policy say, and our advice is it should reflect government guidelines in relation to employee obligations. It needs to be in writing so that it's fully clear and needs to be communicated to your employees. Make sure everybody understands their responsibilities. So when somebody requests annual leave now, as part of whatever normal process you would have, make sure that you update employees in relation to their obligations if they are traveling. In relation to returning to work, remember there's a return to work form that they still need to complete 3 days before their return. And if somebody is going abroad, you can seek flight details for confirmation of return date and where they were, etc., if quarantine applies. However, remember this is completely based on trust, and under the Health and Safety and Welfare at Work Act, employees have an obligation to ensure their own safety and those of their colleagues also, and this completely falls under that obligation, that they would notify you of any travel that they have undertaken. And it's important just to be aware of that, and making sure that we let our employees know of those obligations also. So I'm going to pass you back over to Amanda, who's going to do our next poll.
Great, thanks, Caroline. My God, there is a lot of food for thought in that, and I suppose it really points to the amount of work that's involved in maintaining those staff policies up to date, and also possibly revisiting and refreshing some health and safety training as well at various points throughout the year, probably more frequently than you would have had to do in the past. So looking at poll 3 then, I suppose, I'm considering and digesting all that, can we just maybe get a sense check from you if you have looked at updating and have completed updating of staff policies and looked at communications in light of those government updates of the 18th of August, everything from illness, travel, absences, etc. So while we wait the results of that poll, Caroline, there's a few questions that have come in on the back of what you were talking about there. When you reference the importance of communicating with staff, both those at work and on layoff, how should we be communicating with them, and what should we really be saying?
So I think it depends on the employee circumstances. If they're on layoff, obviously we'll be communicating any updates we have in relation to their return, and we'll be communicating to see, are they on layoff because their department hasn't reopened? Is it likely to reopen? You know, is it specific to their role, etc. So I think communication while on layoff is really important. And even in the absence of a big update, I would say once a month you should be checking in with those people at minimum. If the employees are at work, I would say you've all now done your government protocol in terms of return. And it's important now, I would say, to do a refresher in terms of that training. Ideally, that training is done and it is signed off, and that can be a combination of updating staff in relation to policies, as well as updating staff in relation to protocol. And a lot of those policies you've outlined there, Helen, and a lot of them also will be things like wearing of face masks, you know, how to do it correctly, etc. And that type of training, because it's health and safety related, should be signed off and kept on the employee's file.
Great. Just a question in relation to that, I suppose, Caroline, given the amount of update you're talking about in policies here, would you agree that it would be advisable to actually, you know, ensure that all employees get copies of that and sign copies of it as having read it and understood it?
I think the easiest thing to do, Amanda, is, as you know, the staff handbook is the best place for all these policies, and the easiest way is to update your staff handbook and then reissue the staff handbook, and ideally get staff to sign it off over a period of time. And ideally the department manager that's relevant to those staff would do a socially distanced training session, or toolbox talk as we call them, to remind people of the key risks in their department and also of the key relevant updates in relation to the policies.
Okay, that's great. Caroline, just one last one here now. In regard to holiday leave accrual during layoff, what is the position on that?
So if employees have worked more than 1,365 hours, you know, in terms of the whole year, they're entitled to their normal 4 weeks holidays. If the employees haven't, they get 8% of the total hours they've worked. So it depends on how many hours that employee has worked, but hours are accrued based on hours worked.
Okay, great. Great. And in regard to that, does the same apply in relation to public holiday accrual?
So public holidays is different. So you're entitled to a public holiday if you have 40 hours worked in the previous 5 weeks. So that depends on what hours the employee worked in relation to public holidays.
Thanks. Okay, that's great. Okay, Colette, if we can have the results of that poll, please, that'd be great. Okay, so there is still a good bit of work to be done by some there in terms of getting all of those policies and communications updated and out to your staff and making sure staff have signed and understood them. So a lot of work, but as we said, highlighted really, I suppose, from government updates on the 18th and the need to keep those policies and, as you said, staff handbook just live documents really very much in the current climate. So back over to you, Caroline.
Thank you so much, Amanda. And I think the fact that many of you are in progress is actually a good thing, because as you know, a lot of the policies are updating on an ongoing basis. So even though we might be suggesting that you update your handbook, you won't be updating your handbook every week. A new update is going to come out. But I think September is a good kind of time to do an update if you haven't done one since the start of people returning, and then maybe do an update in January again. And if any changes in policy happen in the meantime, you're communicating them with staff. Because as you will all know, the burden of proof is on the employer to ensure they've updated the employees in relation to all their obligations. And that the best way and the only way really that you can confirm you've done that is the paper trail. So try and, if you can, as I say, over the coming weeks, that might be possible. So we're experiencing a lot of challenges at the moment in the whole area of well-being in the workplace. With back to school, with seasonality, with changes in terms of restrictions, with COVID itself, etc. You have a lot of people anxious and stressed, and oftentimes that can manifest itself in the workplace, which can be quite challenging. It's important from an employer perspective that we try and do all we can to ensure that we're minimising any employee grievances, any issues from a customer service perspective, etc. And again, maintaining that standard. So ultimately, I suppose, acknowledging and flagging that to people in those team briefings that we spoke about is very important, ensuring that we still have our open door policy, that if people are experiencing specific challenges, they can come and talk to us. And also there may be other additional things you may want to consider. For example, an employee assistance program. You need to maybe upskill your managers in terms of dealing with people who might, for example, be coming to them to say, listen, my kids are unwell, I won't be in today. And that becomes a regular occurrence, and how they deal with that. Because I would expect that your managers now will be dealing with new HR challenges, and it's important that we upskill them in that regard. Communication is key, and outlining frequently asked questions to your staff within the departments. Trying to implement, I suppose, communication and some elements of sociability into the work environment is also something a lot of employers are now considering. So all of these things are designed to try and increase productivity, ensure retention of your staff, and without doubt, visible leadership from good managers now is definitely something that is showing hugely in businesses that are bringing employees with them. So again, assisting managers in that regard. So I touched on this already, and we're going to focus on the whole concept of reducing staff hours, the right to request redundancy, redundancy itself, and collective redundancy, as Amanda mentioned in our next webinar. But because of the timeliness and this important date, we wanted to highlight this important piece of legislation to you in today's webinar. So the government introduced on the 13th of March under emergency legislation the option for an employee to be able to invoke redundancy and request redundancy if they were on an extended period of layoff that was paused by the government. And that pause has been extended on a number of occasions, and it is now suspended until the 17th of September 2020. In relation to the redundancy option for employees to request redundancy, since we recorded this webinar, this scheme is now paused until the 30th of November 2020. There's no indication that that's going to be extended past the 17th of September, but we would positively hope that it will be, because our concern is that if it's not extended, you could have an employee who requests you to make them redundant, and if you're not in a position to give them work that's continuous for a period after that, you may need to give them redundancy. And based on the season we're coming into, it'll probably be challenging for many of you to give them that certainty of work, you know, as required in line with the legislation. So we'll cover that in a lot more detail when we discuss it with you in our next webinar, but we just wanted to flag it with you, particularly in light of the fact that the PUP payment is also, you can't have anybody new joining the PUP payment after the 17th of September.
In relation to the PUP payment, this is now being extended until the 1st of April 2021, and applications will be accepted up till the end of 2020. This is the most recent information we have in relation to this scheme, which has been updated since we recorded this webinar.
So those two key dates collide, and as a result, it's important just for you to be aware of the implications. We've highlighted those key dates separately for you because they are so important, and the first being the 5th of September, where new and seasonal employees who from the 1st of July, so for all of July, all of August, you can backdate the new subsidy scheme if they already didn't, if you didn't claim the TWSS for them, but they must be, you must be registered and you must have that claim in by then. So that's a very important date for any of you that is relevant. And I'm sure for a lot of you who may have experienced an upsurge in business in the last number of weeks due to staycationing, that might be relevant. So it's important to be aware of that date. The other key dates are both the same and they're very much interlinked. So on the 17th of September, no new applicants will be accepted for the PUP. So after that, if you lay somebody off, instead of having a maximum of up to 300, depending on what they're earning, they will just be going to job seekers. And the second key date is the 17th of September also for that option of the employee to invoke redundancy. So again, just to be aware of both of the 5th of September and the 17th as very relevant dates. So I suppose as we conclude the webinar, before we do some questions, the importance of remaining calm and ensuring that we communicate very proactively with our staff in relation to the plans. And for many, that's important in terms of doing that now, because a lot of people are asking lots of questions in relation to implications for them. Take stock of your business requirements and take stock of the schemes and how they may be relevant to you and relevant to financially ensuring you're maximizing that opportunity in the coming weeks and months ahead is very important, particularly in relation to that new subsidy that we covered in this morning's session. And finally, as always, and we've highlighted it throughout today's webinar also, the importance of that paper trail goes without saying. So it's really important that you're very familiar with the paper trail, so ensure you don't forget the paper trail. So they're the kind of key points before I hand you back to Amanda, who's going to do our final poll today.
Thanks very much, Caroline. So, yes, looking at our final poll now, I suppose it'll be interesting for us to understand, are there further plans or actions that you've identified from today's webinar that you believe now that you will need to address in the workplace? And while we are waiting for the results of everybody's views on that, there's just a few questions here, Caroline. First of all, are under 18s eligible for the EWSS? Have we clarity on that in the guidelines?
So there has been no guideline in relation to age restrictions in relation to the scheme, but I expect Revenue will clarify that. At the moment, they haven't highlighted any, either that they are or that they aren't.
Great, okay. And a difficult one here, Caroline, and it kind of brings us back to this whole area of layoff, particularly people who've been on layoff now for quite a while. And given what you're saying about, you know, if people are not moved to layoff before the 17th of September, the PUP won't apply, and they'll be moving them really onto job seekers, or they'll be moving to job seekers.
In relation to the PUP payment, this is now being extended until the 1st of April 2021, and applications will be accepted up till the end of 2020. This is the most recent information we have in relation to this scheme, which has been updated since we recorded this webinar.
What if layoff is the preferred employee option and it's quite possible they feel vulnerable to return to work, or if they're caring for vulnerable? What's your guidance in terms of how you handle that again?
So we'll cover this, Amanda, in more detail now in our next webinar.
But
our advice is an employee is only eligible for layoff if you have no work available for them. So if an employee is unavailable to come to work for any of those examples that you've outlined, then we need to look at alternative types of leave. So they might want to take parental leave, they might want to take carers leave, they might want to take unpaid absence, and we need to manage them through maybe the long-term absence process, etc. It's definitely not something we'd be recommending to give the employee the option to choose, because we had a big issue when employees were requested to come off the PUP payment after businesses reopened, where some of them said, look, I'm actually happier on the 350 on the PUP payment, which it was then, than to actually come back to work. So even though the employer had work available for them, we had to proactively manage people to get them to return. So we definitely wouldn't want to be encouraging employees to feel that layoff is optional. So because we would be starting to set bad practice. So I would say if an employee is choosing not to come back for whatever reason, we need to proactively manage them. And indeed, if you have any employees who currently are on the books that are falling into that category of long-term absence, or indeed who feel they can't come back, I think it's really important you start to engage with them now, because unfortunately COVID is here for a very long time, and we need to very much proactively, engage with people in terms of, return.
Okay, thanks, Caroline. And just another question here. Your reference to the 1,365 hours worked in January for their leave entitlement, or a portion of that given number of hours worked. Question here is that in regard to is that in regard to time worked from the 1st of January, or is it in the previous 12 months?
So that is in your holiday year. So the tax year in terms of legislation is normally April to April, unless you in your terms and conditions have highlighted that your calendar year is January to December. So whichever year, if you're silent on it in your contract of employment, it would be the April calendar year, and if not, then it is the January to December one, if as many employers would normally have the calendar year as the holiday year. So that's how you would work that out, and it is in total for the entire year. So that would take into account for that full calendar year and that full 12-month period, whether they've worked the 1,365 hours or not.
So in accordance with your holiday calendar then. Okay, great.
Indeed.
So can you join EWSS later in the year as a business, Caroline?
You need to register for it now, and that's crucially important. So once you've registered, then you can decide when you make a submission. So for some businesses, they may be still very busy, and for September, they may decide that they don't meet the eligibility criteria for September, but over the full 6-month period, they may meet the eligibility criteria and they can apply for October, November, December. So that's why it's so important to do your forecasts, do your plans, and assess your criteria. But I would say the registering is important. And one other point about the scheme, like all revenue schemes, employers who apply and avail of the scheme will be published by revenue in that list that they normally publish, and that's normal practice by revenue as well.
Great, thanks, Caroline. That's an important point. So absolute guidance, you register now. Whether or not you choose to claim on the scheme or not, you can judge that month by month, but the registration deadline of the 5th of September is key, I think we're saying. Is that right?
That's important. And remember, if you apply month by month, you still have to take the 6 months together into account to see are you 30% down in turnover. So even though you might be applying not for every month, you still have to take the 6 months reference period into account.
Yeah. So revenue are looking at it cumulatively over the 6 months, July to December. That's right. Yeah. And then, Caroline, just going forward, can new employees be added to the EWSS after September if you have to take on staff in October, for example?
They haven't made that clear, and I suppose ultimately we're recommending that you register for the scheme by the 5th of September so that you can avail of the option to backdate it if you need to for the employees who are on your, the new employees that you may have employed for July and August, and the new hires and the seasonal staff. So that's the really relevant date of the 5th of September in that regard. So again, we're very early in the revenue guideline draft, i.e. we've only one draft. So I expect in draft 2, we will get a lot more guidance in relation to all of those things. But for practical purposes, if you feel you're eligible, which again, we saw in your poll earlier on, many people, the numbers were very high in terms of those that had already decided that they were relevant to them. So I think from that perspective, it's really important.
Okay. Another one here, can PUP be claimed by an employee who started work in July but will need to be laid off in August? I think we've confirmed that you can move them to PUP up to the 17th of September, but after that, it's job seekers.
That's exactly it.
In relation to the PUP payment, this is now being extended until the 1st of April 2021, and applications will be accepted up till the end of 2020. This is the most recent information we have in relation to this scheme, which has been updated since we recorded this webinar.
That's great. And just one here actually, and it's one you and I were chatting about yesterday, Caroline. If the employee chooses to go on holidays and they are required to self-isolate on return, and particularly, they could leave to what they think is a green country, and by the time they come back, that green country list could be changed. If they're required to self-isolate, are you required to pay sick pay, or does government support that?
So the answer to that is ultimately, if an employee, there's a couple of policies, and this is why your policies are so important. And from a HR point of view, we always say if it's not in paper, it never happened, or you can't rely on it. So in relation to your annual leave policy, I would update that now to reflect we have a green list. These are the green list countries. Should you wish to go on holidays, and you're planning to go abroad, you need to be mindful of what it says in the green list in terms of your obligations, in terms of quarantining, etc. Obviously, the green list can change, and if that happens, you are putting the onus back on the employee to take responsibility for that. And if they're going to a non-green list country for whatever reason, and you're approving their annual leave, then ultimately they need to apply for the additional 2 weeks that they need to quarantine when they come back. So again, your annual leave policy is what you're going to rely on for all of that. And again, that all falls back to health and safety and the obligations employees have, because if an employee comes back and says, well, look, I don't want to quarantine, or I don't, ultimately, these are the government guidelines, and from a health and safety perspective, as employers, we're obliged to enforce and uphold those guidelines. So it's important that your policies are very clear, and that's why I would update your policy now in advance, because we don't know what will happen with the green list. There's talk of it being abolished, extended, reduced, etc. So ultimately, we need to go with the advice at the time.
That's great, Caroline. Yeah, thank you. I think that's going to be just remain a very dynamic list, really. So I think it's important to, as you say, have that really clear, really out in your policy. Colette, if it's all right with you, just given that we are now coming up close on time, can we get the results of that poll, please? So delighted to hear that so many of you have found and identified in this webinar some additional work that needs to be done. I know you don't want to be coming on webinars to find additional work, but I think it's important that we've been able to help you identify some critical things that need to be put in place really in accordance with the pending deadlines. So delighted to see that. So just in regard to closing out then, any questions that we didn't get to answer for you today, we will include in our FAQs. And just to remind people on the PowerPoint presentation here, which will accompany the recording of the webinar, we've given you a link to the EWSS guidelines. So they are up on Revenue, available for you now to look at, and that link will remain live, and any updated guidelines will be reflected in that link as it goes on. So stay in contact with that link as we go through the next week, because as Caroline says, there is still some things not yet clarified, and we expect that those clarifications in the coming days. So finally, it just remains for me to thank you very much for your time in joining us here today, to thank Caroline as always for her expertise and very practical guidance in these situations. Reminding you then, we will have a link to the website, or to the webinar, sorry, on our recent updates on our website, COVID-19 Support Hub, by close of play tomorrow, and we'll also email you out a link to those. You have on your screen now some additional links for Revenue where these guidelines are contained. And just to say to you that we look forward to picking up with you again on the 8th of September. Don't forget, if you haven't registered, to do that. Just click back to the invitation that you would have got for this event on Friday last, or the reminder you would have got yesterday, to register for the second part of this webinar. And just to say a huge thanks as well to Colette and the team at Razor Social for keeping us all online in the technology front, and to Helen, my colleague, for moderating the questions with me today. As I said, anything we didn't get to cover, we will include in the supporting FAQ that will accompany the two webinars when we complete the one on the 8th of September. If you have any burning questions in the meantime that you really need advice on, please reach out to your local Fáilte Ireland contact. They're there to support you, and we'll filter those questions through for immediate responses if they are of urgent matters in that regard. So it just remains me to say, have a good day everyone, take care, gur míle maith agat agus slán go fóill.